The United Kingdom's general election for the year 2024 is over. I do not believe there is a single soul on either side of the Atlantic Ocean who will argue otherwise. It is over. And while yes, there are looming questions about who will be the official opposition and how well Reform UK will perform, no one, and when I say no one, I mean no one, is doubting that Keir Starmer will be the next Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Hi, welcome to the Politicowl, and here I want to talk about the UK's coming general election, and more specifically, its foregone conclusion, the election of Keir Starmer and the Labour Party to the highest office in the land. Now, a bit of a preface, I should state that I am not British. I'm not from the United Kingdom, nor am I from Europe. I'm actually from Canada. So, while I am not from there is a cultural connection to myself and the United Kingdom, which has kept me interested in British politics for quite some time. So I'm happy to be talking about this here. So if you guys like hearing what I have to say on the matter and found this video informative, please like the video, drop a comment on how you think Keir Starmer will do as the UK's next leader, and subscribe to the channel, as it really does help me out. Now, despite the fact that Keir Starmer is going to be the next Prime Minister, he does actually remain a bit of a mystery to a lot of people. He's been very evasive and just hasn't said all that much, simply because he hasn't needed to. This has actually been a pretty astute move on his part, because saying too much can absolutely destroy a politician should they not say the right thing. You have to look no further than the recent debate between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, which singularly saw Joe Biden's chance at a second term evaporate on the spot. So, let's look into who Keir Starmer really is, where he's come from, who he's been, and who he will be as Prime Minister. Keir Starmer was born on September 2nd, 1962 in Southwark, London, before eventually going on to study at the University of Leeds and get a Bachelor's of Law. His performance at the University of Leeds would eventually net him a postgraduate scholarship to study law at Oxford, where he would become a Bachelor of Civil Law. After this, he would then be called to the bar at Middle Temple in 1987, which was a prestigious step that marked the beginning of his career as a barrister. After this, he would then go on to become a Member of Parliament in a Labour safe seat in London, that seat being Holborn and St Pancras. For those a little more well-versed in the history of UK politics, all of this should sound a little bit familiar, because it is the exact same career track taken by former Labour Prime Minister Tony Blair, who himself studied law at Oxford, became a barrister, and then became an MP in a Labour safe seat. However, Tony Blair's seat was in the north of England, while Starmer's was, again, in London. It should also be noted they both came to power in similar circumstances, riding towards a landslide victory because, let's be honest, that's what Starmer's gonna get, in the face of a deeply unpopular Tory government that had been in power for far too long. In the case of Tony Blair, it had been Margaret Thatcher's government that had been in power before she was removed and replaced by John Major, and surprisingly John Major won a second prime ministership in 1992 because of his effective campaign strategy and his good public image. However, he would be absolutely annihilated in the next election by Tony Blair, who was a lively and dynamic figure as compared to John Major, who was probably the single most boring man in England, which knowing England is saying a lot. It should also be noted that a lot of Tony Blair's success also came from his ability to move the Labour Party closer to the centre and shake their old image of a very far left party. This is something that Keir Starmer has also done effectively. Move Labour closer to the centre to generate broader appeal as opposed to being more far left as it has previously been seen under the likes of people like Jeremy Corbyn. So upon hearing that, you might think, oh, is Starmer just gonna be like Tony Blair 2.0? Well, honestly, yeah, he might actually be. And this is something that is reflected in his policy positions, but we'll get more on that later. First off, let's talk about his time as an MP, because as a Member of Parliament, he would hold positions that were a little more centrist. He was always in the party's center, but never too far as to grate against what was happening. One example is that he would become the shadow Brexit secretary for 2016 to 2020. In this capacity, he would advocate for a second referendum on the final Brexit deal, but never ever said we should undo Brexit. He was always willing to accept the result. However, he always advocated for a very close relationship with the European Union. This is something that sets him apart from his predecessor Jeremy Corbyn, who was absolutely obliterated by Boris Johnson. And a big part of that defeat was not just Jeremy Corbyn's radical image as a hardline leftist, something Keir Starmer has done a very good job of avoiding, but also the fact that Corbyn was never really clear on where he stood with regard to Brexit. He talked about a possible second referendum, but never really explained where he would stand on it, and was just very ambiguous in a time when a lot of people were very pro-Brexit. And even though Brexit has become very unpopular as of late, due to Tory mismanagement, Starmer holding his ground and saying, "No, I will respect what people have decided," has done a very good job of making him seem like a reasonable center option, especially to the more traditional Labour voters in the north who switched Tory, because they're the ones who are very much in favour of Brexit. Furthermore, he also hasn't alienated the progressive London wing of the party because he is still very clear he wants close relations with the EU. This is something I've noticed in modern politics. People really underestimate the power of compromise and the middle ground. You have to understand, the British electorate are exhausted. They're absolutely enervated. And the Tories have done so much to alienate their base, who didn't concern themselves just with Brexit, but also very heavily with immigration. You see, they completely failed to slash immigration numbers like they had promised time and time again to do. So all Labour has really had to do is state on one hand they won't deport asylum seekers, but on the other hand they want to reduce net migration without really making any clear promises. And I think that lackluster yet effective stance on immigration really highlights the unique nature of this campaign. The Tories are so wildly unpopular, Labour just hasn't had to promise much or do much other than not be the Tories. What's the old saying? Never interrupt your enemy when he's making a mistake? Starmer's middle-of-the-road approach also applies to industrial policy, where he stated in the manifesto that he effectively doesn't want to strangle the hydrocarbon industry in Britain, but won't issue new exploration charters. So they won't be drilling for new oil or laying new pipelines, but they will be exhausting what they currently have going, instead of reducing numbers like other Labour politicians would aim to do. Furthermore, he's quite keen on nuclear energy, aiming to build several smaller reactors across the United Kingdom, something that a lot of other leftist parties across Europe seem really against for some insane reason. This moment right here is where I'm gonna let my personal bias show just a little bit. I am pretty firmly center-right in my personal politics. Not very far right, not very much of a fence sitter either. I don't know if I'd ever vote Republican if I was an American, but I am comfortable voting for center-right parties in Canada and in Europe. And even I'm willing to admit Starmer's policies, not too shabby in my opinion, especially since a lot of the language he uses in his manifesto surrounding green energy is centered around the creation of jobs, specifically high-quality, high-paying jobs. Furthermore, he wants to create a new public company called Great British Energy, which is something I'm not crazy about. I'm more of a privatization guy myself, but hey, at least he has some ideas. And as you could expect from a Labour politician, a lot of his platform also revolves around the NHS, specifically wanting to increase their funding, recruit new nurses, and also recruit more daycare workers and other services aimed at children, specifically because he cited the fact that under the Labour government, child poverty has significantly risen in the United Kingdom. However, as someone who is generally conservative, the question I have to ask as a reflex whenever these things are suggested, where do you plan to get the money for all this? And in Starmer's manifesto, he puts a pretty significant emphasis on tax reform, especially with regard to increasing taxes on the most wealthy members of society, but doesn't really get into the hardcore socialist language like redistributive tax policy that Jeremy Corbyn utilized, which helped scupper his campaign and turn voters off from him. Instead, he uses terms like fairer tax policy. The optics on this guy are honestly really admirable. There is one thing I would like to mention though that is interesting. It's another parallel people have drawn between Keir Starmer and Tony Blair, that being Keir Starmer's dedication to, quote, taking back their streets. You see, he wants to recruit more police officers in a time when a lot of leftists want less police officers and police institutions defunded. This can be seen as a parallel to when Tony Blair cast himself as a, quote, tough-on-crime candidate. Now, the interesting thing here is that this will alienate the more progressive voters in the Labour Party's pool. However, they're making up for that when they draw in the center and people who voted Tory last time. They're pulling more from their traditional base that they lost beforehand and letting some of their newer, more progressive base slip away. Those people are organically going towards the Lib Dems, who are seen as the more progressive party. We actually have one of these here in Canada, and they are also, funnily enough, orange-colored, the New Democratic Party, or NDP. And this has paid dividends, with the Lib Dems seeing an increase in their polling percentage according to Politico, to the point where some people believe they might actually surpass the dying Tories to become the official opposition in Parliament. It's funny, it almost seems like a win-win. Furthermore, he also wants to increase the amount of teachers in the United Kingdom, and also wants to increase the amount of housing available, housing being a pretty significant issue in this coming election, wherein his policy has mainly been, hey, the Tories say they want to build this many number of houses, well, we're gonna build this many more than them. Pretty basic, but decently effective. Now, to wrap this all up, I do want to address something I'd been saying a few times in this video, that being the fact that Keir Starmer is going to be a, quote, Tony Blair 2.0. You see, what people remember Tony Blair for is how hated he is nowadays, and the reason his reputation is in such shambles is a few-fold. The first one being the Iraq War. Tony Blair would join the invasion of Iraq on the American side, despite the fact that most of the British electorate was wildly opposed to it. It's actually funny because it made him look like an American puppet, the same criticism that had led to Margaret Thatcher's downfall and the erosion of her public perception. Furthermore, Tony Blair moved more towards free market neoliberal economics, which the traditional Labour voting base saw as a deep betrayal that absolutely screwed them over, which, funnily enough, is actually part of the reason why Margaret Thatcher is also deeply hated. Starmer, for his part, doesn't really seem to be in line with that way of thinking, and as such will probably avoid that kind of backlash. But there is one issue, that being the conflict in Gaza. You see, a lot of Labour voters and leftists across the UK have been pretty openly dissatisfied with Keir Starmer's position on Gaza, because in November he actually voted against a motion that would demand an immediate ceasefire. And only a few days ago, he in a radio interview said that he would not, quote, pronounce that something is either genocide or not, and reaffirmed Israel's right to self-defense. Given the increasingly large influence the Islamic voting bloc has in UK politics, this is something that is predicted to alienate no small amount of voters. But the real question is this going to have any meaningful impact on the election results? The answer to that question being no, of course not, don't be crazy. However, it does contribute to the fact that Keir Starmer is not particularly popular. In fact, according to YouGov, only 30% of voters have a favorable view of Keir Starmer. However, it should be noted that Rishi Sunak only gets 20% of a favorable view. In fact, according to YouGov, the most popular federal candidate is actually Nigel Farage at 38%. That is in large part due to the force of his personality and the fact that Nigel Farage is a wildly savvy politician. However, Keir Starmer is basically like a wet piece of toast. However, if you actually know British cuisine, a wet piece of toast isn't actually all that unappealing to them, especially when you factor in that the other option is a piece of bread which is currently radioactive. The big issue though would probably be Keir Starmer's legacy after the fact, whether or not he's viewed favorably by the eyes of history, or if he's viewed as just the guy who was in the right place at the right time. But in reality, does it matter? All he really has to do to be seen as doing a quote-unquote good job is not destroy the economy further and not plunge Britain into absolute electoral chaos again. It's like the old adage really says, it's good to set people's expectations really low so that you can wow them by doing basically nothing at all. Here's to you, Prime Minister Starmer. Good luck. But what do you guys think? Do you guys think he will make a good prime minister and can probably bring the UK back to some kind of stability? Or do you think he's just going to make everything worse and that the UK is blundering headlong into the next Tony Blair? I'd love to hear what you guys have to say in the comments below, especially those of you who are actually from the United Kingdom. And if you like this video and would like to hear more from me in the future, please subscribe if you have not already done so and hit that notification bell. Again, it really does help small channels like mine grow. But until then, I will see you in the next video.